What if I told you that your lack of motivation is not the end, but the beginning of your authentic life? The collapse you fear is the ego's funeral. Yes, let us begin. When the false self dies, it is not merely an egoic adjustment, it is the disintegration of the very scaffolding that once upheld our desires, ambitions, and worldly cravings. The self that once longed for recognition, power, status, and security begins to vanish like mist at sunrise. And in that moment, the psyche, disoriented and stripped of its old appetites, sinks into an abyssal quiet. Many call this losing motivation, but it is something far more profound. It is a death, a necessary one. In my early years observing patients torn between outer ambition and inner emptiness, I noticed a strange pattern. Those who appeared most successful often reached a breaking point not due to failure, but because the persona they had built their empire upon was hollow. Once this mask collapsed, even the fruits of their labor turned tasteless. Why? Because their striving had not come from their soul, but from a borrowed identity, one that society rewarded but the self never recognized. It was in confronting my own dark nights, when fame and academic validation rang hollow in my ears, that I realized this truth. True desire does not arise from the ego, but from the depths of being. The great Stoic Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Because your own strength is rooted in your inner self, not in the shifting opinions of others." This inner root, however, is only accessed when the outer self withers. People often ask, why do I feel no drive after my awakening? It is because they are waiting for the old self to rise again with new enthusiasm. But that self is gone. Its motives, vanity, fear, social climbing have been laid to rest. And in their place, nothing stirs yet. This nothingness is not failure, but fertility. Just as winter strips the trees bare, not to kill them, but to prepare them for new growth. Let it die. Let the old self rot in peace. From this decay, a more authentic longing will emerge, not to achieve, but to become. And in that becoming, a new kind of wealth arises, the kind that nourishes not only the pocket, but the soul. You believe you are lazy, perhaps broken, that something within you has failed. But I tell you now, what you are experiencing is not a flaw in your character. It is a sacred stage of transformation, known to the alchemists as negrito, the blackening, the death before rebirth. The fire has not gone out. It has simply descended into the earth. And until you understand this, you will continue to shame yourself for not doing more, not realizing that the soul itself has taken you into its crucible. In the ancient alchemical texts, negrito was described as the stage where all matter putrefies, where the old form is broken down so thoroughly that nothing of its previous shape remains. This is not destruction for its own sake, it is the divine chaos from which new order can arise. In psychological terms, this is the period when all our former goals, pleasures, and external rewards lose their meaning. It feels like apathy, but it is in truth a profound invitation to go within, to examine the essence beneath the illusion. I recall a time in my life where the weight of my own soul pressed so heavily upon me that even speaking felt like labor. I did not wish to write, to speak, to teach things that once gave me joy. But what I learned through suffering was this. It was not laziness, but gestation. The ego was dissolving. A deeper self was preparing to emerge. To call this laziness is like blaming the seed for not blooming in winter. The philosopher Heraclitus said, "The path up and down are one and the same." We forget this. We call the downward movement failure, when in truth it is the descent necessary for ascension. And so, in this phase of darkness, what you must practice is not effort, but patience, not productivity, but presence. When gold is refined, it first turns black. Do not panic in the darkness. You are not unmotivated. You are becoming real. Let the world think you are idle. The soul does not measure its progress by clocks and calendars, but by how fully you surrender to its fire. What you once called motivation was not always noble. Often it was the feverish striving of the ego, desperate to prove itself, to be admired, to belong. In the earlier phases of life, we are driven by shadows in disguise, the desire to be validated, to escape shame, to outpace the fear of insignificance. But once the spiritual awakening begins, those illusions are stripped away like brittle bark, and suddenly the fuel runs dry. Not because you are broken, but because the fire that once drove you was never truly yours. You mistook momentum for meaning. You chased success, recognition, even service, because they gave you identity. But the self, the deep, eternal center of your being, does not hunger for these things. It waits in stillness. It waits for the illusion to collapse so that something more sacred can rise. When this awakening dawns, it can feel like exhaustion, like loss, but it is the withdrawal of counterfeit energy, the collapse of borrowed ambition. In my own life, I once labored furiously to gain respect in the academic world. I studied, published, debated, believing I was following truth. But the truth was, I feared irrelevance. I feared the silence, and when I could no longer bear the inner dissonance, everything crumbled. I lost my drive. Yes, but only because it was never anchored in the self. And from that hollowing came a deeper vision. I no longer cared to impress minds. I desired to transform souls. Seneca once wrote, "He who is everywhere is nowhere." So it is with the man who chases every glittering thing, he loses his center. Your spiritual awakening exposes this scattering. It turns your face away from the applause of the crowd and toward the silence of the soul. And in that silence, purpose begins to take on a new tone, not loud, not urgent, but true. So when the drive you once relied upon vanishes, do not mourn it as weakness. You are not failing, you are shedding. And what will come next is not motivation, but meaning. And meaning, unlike illusion, does not burn out. It abides. It waits for you to be ready. We are raised in a world that glorifies progress. Every hour must be measured, every step forward praised. We are taught to ask, what's next? What more? But in the aftermath of spiritual awakening, there comes a strange stillness. The craving for forward motion falls silent. You may look upon yourself and think, I'm losing my ambition, when in truth, you are being summoned inward. The ego thrives on progression. It seeks movement not for meaning, but for identity. Yet the soul, the eternal aspect within you, has no use for progress. It demands presence. And presence feels at first like standing still in a storm. I remember this stillness when I left the tower of success I had built brick by brick. At one time, I measured my worth by how many books I published, how many eyes read my thoughts. But then came a moment subtle but irreversible when all that striving tasted hollow. My mind asked, why stop now? But something deeper whispered, be still. That stillness, that revolt against progress frightened me. I feared becoming nothing. But in that pause, I touched something truer than all my prior pursuits, the sacred now. As Heraclitus once wrote, you could not step twice into the same river. The soul knows this. It knows that life is not linear, but eternal. It knows that to truly awaken is not to conquer the world, but to be fully present in a single breath. The ego wants to climb, to conquer, to become. The soul wants to witness, to listen, to be. So when your motivation to move ahead collapses, do not mistake it for failure. You are not lazy. You are being initiated. You are being stripped of the need to rush, so that you may learn how to remain. And in that presence, you will find a depth of being that no achievement could ever offer. This is not the death of purpose, it is the birth of truth. There comes a moment after the upheaval of awakening, when everything loses its shape, your desires, your goals, your very sense of identity. It feels as if you have stepped into a vast silence, a space between who you once were and who you are becoming. But this void is not a mistake. It is the sacred cocoon, the alchemical chamber where formlessness reigns. The caterpillar does not become the butterfly by adding wings to its crawling body. No, it dissolves into liquid darkness. It forgets what it was so it may remember what it truly is. In this stage, you will feel like nothing. You may even cry out, who am I if I am not what I used to chase? That cry is holy. That emptiness is sacred. When I faced this dissolution in my own psyche, it was not gentle. The structures I built, ideas, beliefs, ambitions, began to rot from within. And I resisted, of course. I tried to rebuild them with willpower, but what was once meaningful had become lifeless. I was being asked not to build, but to surrender to the fire that consumes all false form. As the mystic Angelus Silesius once wrote, you must become nothing if you want to become all. This is the spiritual law of transformation. The soul cannot inhabit what is still clinging to its previous mask. So your exhaustion, your lack of motivation, is not regression, it is preparation. You are dissolving, not disappearing. You are entering the fertile void, where the ego loosens and the soul reshapes you from the inside out. Do not rush this stage. Do not try to crawl out of the cocoon before your wings are ready. In a world obsessed with form, you are being asked to trust the formless. It is not a punishment. It is grace in its rawest, most terrifying beauty. Let yourself unbe. In this sacred stillness, you are not dying, you are being reborn in silence. When the soul begins to awaken, it does not politely ask for your permission to rearrange your life. It dismantles, it dissolves, it withdraws its energy from all things that no longer carry the scent of truth. What once excited you begins to rot in your hands. The ambitions, relationships, and even spiritual practices that once gave you purpose now feel hollow. And so, you wonder why your motivation has disappeared, but it is not your laziness that speaks. It is your soul saying, no more pretending. There came a time in my life when I could no longer participate in the outer rituals of success. I had studied, achieved, taught, but beneath the applause, I felt an emptiness that words could not explain. The lectures I once delivered with fire began to sound like echoes in a dead hall. I withdrew not out of depression, but because something deeper in me refused to perform any longer. I realized then, the soul does not care for progress built upon pretense. It will sabotage every inauthentic foundation you build, not out of cruelty, but out of love for your true self. Plotinus once said, withdraw into yourself and look. And if you do not find yourself beautiful yet, act as does the creator of a statue. In other words, chip away the false. Let the soul sculpt you through negation. This withdrawal of motivation is not a sign of failure. It is the beginning of integrity. The energy that once powered your persona is returning to its origin, to be redirected into something far more real, far more sacred. You may find yourself unable to explain this to others. They will call you unproductive. They will say you've lost your way. But in truth, you are shedding what was never yours to carry. When the soul withdraws from inauthentic structures, it is not abandoning you. It is inviting you inward where your real work begins. In this silence, you are not falling behind. You are aligning with what cannot be faked. The world teaches us to fear stillness, to equate silence with stagnation, and to interpret inward retreat as the end of all progress. But this is the great delusion of the ego, which confuses motion with meaning. In truth, stillness is not failure. It is the womb of transformation, the silent chamber in which the self begins to take form. Just as the seed must remain buried in darkness before it breaks into life, so too must the soul withdraw into its own depths before it can rise in truth. In my own journey, I remember long months, perhaps even years, when the outward world felt far away, as if I had been submerged beneath the surface of life. I no longer hungered for recognition or activity. I felt no desire to climb or conquer. At first I called it emptiness. I feared I had lost the thread of my own becoming. But with time, I began to see what was truly happening. My former identity was disintegrating, and something deeper, more essential, was quietly emerging beneath the noise. Heraclitus once wrote, "The soul is dyed the color of its thoughts." And in stillness, one finally begins to see the color of those thoughts, undisturbed by the turbulence of action. In this pause, illusions rise to the surface like silt, and one can begin the sacred work of purification. Stillness allows the false self to fall away, not with violence, but with quiet clarity. And in that emptiness, the true self begins to whisper. If you feel you are no longer moving forward, I urge you not to panic. Do not fill the silence with distractions or shame, for what you call stagnation may in fact be gestation. You are not broken. You are becoming. The soul does not bloom in haste. It is in the very absence of momentum that your real life prepares to awaken. So sit with it. Breathe through it. Trust it. For in the quiet, something eternal is being born. When the illusions of the ego begin to collapse, when your old ambitions turn to ash and the drive you once worshipped goes silent, what rises is not light but shadow, and many recoil from this moment, imagining they have regressed, fallen into darkness, or failed their path. But I say to you, the shadow emerges not because you are lost, but because you are finally available to see what was always hidden. In the earlier phases of life, we are consumed by the persona, the mask we wear to meet the demands of society, family, ambition, and success. There is no room in that tight costume for the unloved parts of ourselves. So the shadow waits. It dwells in the margins of consciousness, disguised as irritation, projection, depression, or compulsive desire. But when the old self begins to die, when the fire of awakening scorches your false motivations, there opens a rare space within, and into that space the shadow steps forth. Seneca once said, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself." And I will add, no man becomes whole who does not face his own shadow, for he has not yet met himself. I remember vividly the terror of that emergence in my own life, the rage that had been masked by courtesy, the envy hidden beneath moral superiority, the sadness buried under control. It was not easy to witness, but once seen, these aspects no longer ruled me from the dark. They could be integrated, understood, and ultimately transformed. So if you feel overwhelmed, if old wounds and hidden fears are surfacing, do not believe you are failing. It is a sign that you are growing. The darkness arises only because there is now space for its space. You cleared when you stopped clinging to false desire. The soul, like the moon, has its light and its dark sides. To ignore one is to remain divided, but to embrace the shadow is to become whole. Let it rise. Let it speak. For only in meeting your shadow do you find the fullness of your light. There comes a moment on the path when the fire that once moved you, ambition, desire, competition, the hunger to be someone, burns out completely. And in that stillness, you mistake it for death. You look at your hands and wonder why they no longer reach. You sit before your work and ask why it no longer stirs you. But this is not the end. It is the clearing. The old fire must die so that the true flame, the one born of your essence, may rise uncorrupted. In the early stages of life, our passions are often borrowed. We chase dreams that are not truly ours, but inherited from culture, family, or fear. We seek wealth, not because we understand its sacred utility, but because we believe it will validate our existence. We strive for recognition, not from the soul's fullness, but from the ego's starvation. That fire burns fast, it consumes the wood of falsehood and leaves only ash behind. Plato once wrote, "The fire which warms us is not the same as the fire which burns us." I discovered this intimately during the years of my own disillusionment. The goals I had tirelessly worked toward, once achieved, brought no peace, only a haunting emptiness that echoed louder in success than failure. And in that void, I had to surrender, to allow the burning away of everything that was not mine. It was then, in that sacred quiet, that a new flame emerged, one not born of proving, but of being. It did not roar. It whispered. It asked not what do you want to achieve, but what is it that seeks to be expressed through you. That is the true flame, the flame of individuation, of purpose aligned with soul. It moves differently. It does not race, it endures. It does not shout, it glows. So if your fire has gone out, let it, grieve it, bless it, and then wait. In the ashes of what you thought you needed, something ancient begins to breathe. Not the fire that burns to impress the world, but the flame that was placed in you before the world ever touched you. That is the flame worth serving. There is a peculiar kind of despair that comes after a spiritual awakening. When the illusions fall away, the ego trembles, and the world no longer feels solid beneath your feet. You call it being lost. You say, I don't know who I am anymore. But this very disorientation is sacred. You are not lost. You are undergoing individuation. What feels like collapse is actually the soul breaking free from the scaffolding of who you thought you had to be. To individuate is not to perfect the self. It is to uncover it. It is the process of becoming whole by reclaiming every fragmented piece you once cast aside to be accepted, to be successful, to be loved. And because the world rewards performance over authenticity, this return to self often feels like exile. The things you used to chase no longer hold meaning. The roles you used to play feel like costumes. The motivation you once had dissolves, not because you failed, but because the script you were following is no longer yours. Seneca once said, "No man can swim ashore and take his baggage with him." I too carried such baggage, titles, theories, accomplishments. But when the soul demands your return, it strips you bare. I remember walking through that valley of inner darkness where every label I had identified with fell away, and what was left was something raw and painfully honest. Not a doctor, not a thinker, not a father, just a man confronting the unknown within himself. And it was there, in that sacred unknowing, that I encountered the self not as an idea, but as a living, breathing center that had waited patiently beneath all my striving. It did not speak in the language of goals or ambition. It spoke through dreams, symbols, synchronicities, and subtle longings I had long ignored. So if you feel lost, know this: you are closer to yourself than you've ever been. The map you once used was designed for the ego. Individuation requires that you burn the map and trust the compass within. This is not the end of your path, it is the beginning of your return. And so, as you stand in the stillness where motivation once roared like a flame, do not mistake this silence for failure. This is the space where the self begins to whisper. When the illusions fall, when the false self dies, and the old desires crumble, what remains is the sacred possibility of becoming who you truly are, not the one the world expects, but the one your soul remembers. You are not broken, you are being rebuilt from the inside out. The chaos you feel is not your undoing, but your initiation. The numbness, the loss of drive, the disorientation, these are signs that the old patterns have outlived their usefulness. The time has come to descend, to surrender, and to listen. Do not seek quick fixes. Do not grasp for empty validation. Instead, turn inward. Sit with the discomfort, honor the shadow, follow the quiet pulse of your own becoming. The self does not rise in haste, it emerges through truth. If this message stirs something deep within you, then you are ready. Share this with someone who walks the same invisible path. And remember, the fire may die, but the soul always carries the ember. It is time to awaken, not just spiritually, but wholly.